Hola, ¿qué tal?
Good afternoon, everyone. Those of you who are physically here and those of you who are watching us through the streaming on the website of Fundación Telefónica, I'd like to welcome you. I'm Pablo Gonzalo. I'm responsible for the area of knowledge and digital culture of the Foundation. And today I'm with Isabella Isinger. She is the culture chief of the German Embassy in Madrid. And I'd like to say briefly, I'd like to welcome you. This is the first event that we organized together with the embassy. And we have been very effective because we had a first meeting to see some collaboration possibilities, opportunities, and now 1 month after this, we are already organizing some events. And we love this because in this space we have our own program, but also we want this to be an open space for collaboration for all institutions that have something to say in our lines of work. Today we'll be discussing very relevant issues, architecture, data, the tangible and the non-tangible, with a great presenter, Niklas Maak, who I'd like to thank for being here with us, and also with two people that are very interesting authors in the world of architecture and literature, like Ramón del Castillo and Fernando Quesada, who I'd like to thank also for being here. I don't like to use more time. I'd just like to thank you, thank the presenters and also the embassy, Isabella and her team, for their collaboration that we hope is a long-term collaboration and a fruitful one. Thanks a lot, Pablo, and good afternoon, everyone. Let me tell you just 3 things. First of all, I'd like to say hello on behalf of our ambassador, Wolfgang Wolf. He would love to be here with us. And also on behalf of him, I'd like to thank, of course, Pablo and also Juan. And it is true that we have started speaking about collaboration in January, and we are now in March already doing something. I'd also like to thank Professor Isabel García Adánez, who had the idea for this session, and also Ramón, Fernando, and Niklas Maak, and all of you for your interest. The second thing I wanted to say is that this meeting is part of our year of meetings. This is the motto that we have for our embassy for this year. And why is this? This is because Germany and Spain have very important links of friendship. A friendship needs time and also physical meetings and an exchange of ideas and knowledge in order to be fruitful and united. These relationships that are united and cohesive is what we need to respond with the sovereignty and the strength that we need as Europeans in this global scenario. You know that since last week, this statement is even stronger. And the third thing I wanted to say is that I think it's very important to have a live German thinker here, a living German thinker, because during the 6 months I have been here in Spain, I'm impressed by the knowledge of the Spaniards, of great German thinkers like Goethe, Hegel, Schopenhauer, etc. And it is important to say that just like you here in Spain, we also have living thinkers that it's worth listening to, like Mr. Maak. And I think it's very important his critical analysis of some social issues from the aesthetic of servers and also the human lodging of refugees. He has a point of view of things that are all, not only in relation with architecture in Germany, but he always puts this into a social and international context. So it is great to have him here. So I wish you strength and a new drive and an entertaining time during this session.
Hello, good evening. Thank you for this wonderful introduction. I'm very touched by it and happy to be here and ashamed to not speak in Spanish. Sorry to bombard you here with English. Next time I come, I promise I learn Spanish. So I want to start this conversation with an image of something that is quite bizarre. You can say what you see here is a burning cloud. It was on Wednesday, March 10, 2021, so almost a year ago, that 2 of the 4 data centers of Europe's largest hosting provider, so the place where all our data, our emails, our websites are stored, were destroyed in a nightly fire. Both server farms who burned here contained large amounts of data from government organizations. The city of Colmar's website crashed, and 3.6 million websites went offline forever, including those of banks, news channels, state portals, and government sites. The cloud burned, and the data went up in flames. And of course you could say this can happen because all our data is mirrored in another data farm, so we can just access it again, but that was not the case. Because storing data means you have to pay a lot of money to a provider of these buildings, and many institutions, including the French state, didn't do that. So when the server farm burned down, all the websites, all the content burned down too. So data physically went up in smoke that night, and with it, the reassuring idea that our data is stored somewhere in a cloud, secured in an almost celestial way, forever in global space. In reality, and contrary to what the cloudy rhetoric of providers suggests, the cloud is just a building. In this case, with space for 12,000 servers that can burn down like any other building. This burning server farm that looked a little bit like Wagner's Valhalla of the digital age that night in Strasbourg revealed above all the physicality and vulnerability of data storage technology and of the internet in general. Because we all have an idea of the internet as being something ephemeral, immaterial, that our data is in the cloud just hovering in space, but actually this data is not in space. Whenever you Google something, if you watch a movie, if you download something happens in one of these giant new typologies, which are built in the outskirts of the city in the countryside. So this incident in Strasbourg was interesting because it drew attention to the server farm as a new architectural typology. Server farms or data centers are, I would argue, the most important new building typology of the first days of the 21st century. They are also, to the digital world, what castles used to be in medieval times. They are the seat of power. They are the largest buildings of the present. No building is bigger than that. If you would put it vertically, it would be higher than any skyscraper and bigger than any skyscraper. So they are the largest and maybe most important buildings of the present. At the same time, architecture plays generally no role in their design. Most server farms manage the considerable feat of being huge on the one hand, you can see it here, and totally invisible on the other. You don't find them in a city. So this invisibility of the new power of the digital age has consequences for our democracies. Because for a very long time, you only had to take, let's say, a quick look at a city to understand where the power was. The great town halls of the free cities were symbols of civic pride and counterweights to the castles of the duke and the lords who controlled the land. In modern consumer society, it was the office tower of large corporations. Think of Manhattan and the skyscrapers of Woolworth and Chrysler. They were kind of visible from miles around the city, like built exclamation marks saying, "This is where the power is now," in Chrysler and Woolworth. So there were just exclamation marks built into the city. But today, the digital revolution is changing everything more radically than at any time since the beginning of industrialization, but the influence of tech companies and the economy and politics might be obvious, but these shifts are not longer reflected in our cities. So you can say that the 19th century gave us the train station in the city that defined a whole area. The 20th century gave us the TV tower and the parking garage as typologies, but there is no Google scraper in the form of, let's say, a futuristic architectural search engine. There is no giant cardbox-shaped Amazon theater, and there is no Facebook tower in the form of a gigantic blue thumb. All that doesn't exist. On the contrary, Frank Gehry, who you know has built one of the most iconic buildings in Spain of the last 30 years, has designed an enormously flat hall for Facebook's headquarters with a roof so green that seen from above, it looks like a part of the Bay Area marshlands. So the new technological force has become invisible, and that for a reason. The new typologies of the 21st century built by corporations like Amazon, DHL, or Google lie like fallen skyscrapers in the landscape between highway intersections, business parks, and industrial areas. And no architectural detail, at most a logo here and there, reveal what's going on inside. And they're also meant to be the opposite of architecture. Say nothing, betray nothing, offering no surface for attack. And the fact that data centers, which after all store one of the greatest treasure of the information age, worth billions, are housed in these immense, like faceless hangars outside city limits, is no coincidence. You can also see here, a typical server farm in Germany, so you can hardly tell what's happening inside. And why is that so? And that was the question we started to analyze at the University of Harvard some years ago, and now in Frankfurt, where I'm teaching architecture as a guest professor. We said, how can it be that the biggest buildings of our time are completely invisible to us? We just drive by, we don't pay attention, though all our information, all our communication, our likes and dislikes, our behavior is stored and processed in these structures. And this is even more astounding, as basically you can argue that digitalization is driving the city into an elementary structural crisis that we try to depict here by transforming a beautiful 18th century painting into a more contemporary version of the city of today. Because you can argue that countless post offices, shopping centers, parking garages, office buildings could soon stand empty, if only because the transfer of large amounts of work to home offices and robotized, decentralized production facilities is too economically tempting for their operators. So you can say that very soon shopping malls will be ruins, office towers will be ruins, because we work from home, we unfortunately order everything online. So the city is drastically changing due to what's happening in these big server farms that are coming up on the horizon. But if the central typologies that defined the idea of the city for centuries gradually disappear, then many cities could soon resemble a version of late antique Rome, a modern park of ruins filled with collapsing shopping arcades, overgrowing post offices, and crumbling office complexes. Meanwhile, the typology of the data center is experiencing rapid growth. In 2019, there were well over 3 million data centers in the United States alone, and over 500 hyperscalers. That is the title for extremely large data centers. And the biggest data center in the world operated by China Telecom sprawls over 25 square kilometers near the capital of Inner Mongolia. It's a $1 billion facility with hundreds of thousands of racks. So one reason why we should look at data centers is climate change. Data centers still consume horrendous amounts of energy. Every text message, every video, every tweet starts up a computer somewhere in these farms. And every online bank transfer, and every Instagram photo, every Facebook post, every Google search requires storage space, and data storage requires enormous amounts of energy. So you can argue that the cloud has a pretty big exhaust pipe, and you can see these exhaust pipes very well here. The internet is growing into one of the world's biggest energy guzzlers. It already damages the environment more than the total of all air travel, which is interesting because you think, okay, I'm avoiding the travel with airplanes and then I can watch a movie and post something on Facebook. It is the totality of the internet makes more dirt and puts more gas into the atmosphere than all air travel together. If the internet was a country, it would rank right after the United States and China on place 3 in the disciplines of electricity consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. So the internet consumes more energy than France, Spain, Italy, and most African countries together. And server farms account for 2% of all global greenhouse gas emissions alone. Around 8% of the electricity produced worldwide is used to transport data to end devices, but also to power the gigantic data centers we see here. In response to their apocalyptic consumption, states like Singapore want to ban the construction of new data centers. Apple now builds its own solar parks and runs data centers on green electricity to counter these criticism of polluting the environment. And it's easy to explain why they consume so much, because they have to be air-conditioned, especially if they're located in strategically important but overheated deserts, such as in Reno, Nevada. A large part of the energy, up to 40%, is used for cooling. So we have really to do with a new typology of monsters that shape our daily lives, and I think it's worth looking closer at what happens in these monsters. Because the real problem of server farms does not lie in its energy consumption. They also pose a fundamental threat to democracy, and basically no one, including me, was understanding until recently why. But we did some research, and it's really kind of a dramatic situation. The biggest hyperscaler, so the biggest server farms, is Amazon Web Service. The cloud business is a major contributor to Amazon's operating profit. And we all think that Amazon makes money by sending little parcels to our homes, and we unwrap them, and that's what they make money with. But actually, Amazon's web services account for about $1 billion of Amazon's $1.6 billion total market capitalization, according to analysts. So Amazon makes more money with storing data than with sending parcels to each one of us with the products we want to buy. The second largest hyperscaler is, after Amazon, is Azure, which belongs to the Microsoft company, and Google following in third place. And you all know these names. It's again Amazon, Microsoft, and Google who run the biggest of these servers. So tech companies like these do not only collect users' data, they also build the refineries in which the data is stored and analyzed, and treated as private property, as their property. Such data centers are also places to predict, manipulate, and control the behavior of citizens. Given the fact that all of these companies are based in the US or in China, it becomes clear that not only Europe's technological future is at stake, but also its political and economic sovereignty. The global big data and business analytics market alone is valued over $200 billion. For the first time, US tech stocks are more valuable than the entire European stock market combined. And that gives you an idea, and basically also before I dived into this problematic, I thought, these companies are rich, but what can they do? I mean, they can't harm me with me giving away my data. But if you imagine that 6 companies make more money than the entire European stock market combined, you get an idea of the scale and the power of these new companies. And still in our daily lives, we think that we can not do great harm if we press the accept all button. Most users and most politicians have little or no understanding, even from a purely technical point of view, of what happens to their data in the halls of these cloud operators. And we ask ourselves if it can really be true that skimming behavioral data generates more money than, let's say, building 10 million cars a year. But it's the case. So these companies are worth 100 times more than Volkswagen or General Motors or any oil company. So you see that the data that they process and digest is worth more than anything we have in terms of produce in our time. But no one who keeps clicking accept all out of convenience, and we all know these buttons, no one who clicks it thinks that he's doing harm to himself, that the veritable future of governance, governmentability, and national economies and jobs and billions of dollars are at stake. But they are. Because with everything we do to support these companies, we implement a system that will cost us jobs. Jobs will be eliminated, money that these companies make will transfer from Europe to America. So it has a monstrous effect on our economies and our daily lives. So the market value of these major tech companies, which currently totals $6 trillion, evidences what's in finally for those who master the game of molding the most precisely predictable human being. And that's all what they do. It's basically they predict your future behavior, they try to manipulate you, they try to sell you produce, and that's all they do. And this is worth more than anything you can imagine. Almost unbelievable. But since 2009, Google's revenues have increased by more than 3,500%. So it can be that we will only notice too late or never how we can be spied on, how we can be manipulated, how we can be cheated out of better alternatives on the basis of one's data. And this lack of concern that we all share is already the first success in the manipulation of consciousness by surveillance capitalism, which, promising comfort, undermines the central rights of freedom and self-determination. I will also unfold on that in the following minutes. But most of all, the invisibility of the server and the rhetorical dissolution of manifest political and economic power apparatuses in the cloud, we always talk about the cloud, makes us almost forget about some urgent questions. One of these questions is, where will the trillions go that can be made from selling and mining citizens' data? Who will set the rules for how you are analyzed? And could reclaiming ownership over our data recalibrate the economic basis of a society that does not only delegate civic rights to private parties anymore, and that is more oriented towards solidarity, which is a word which never shows up in the discourse of the Silicon Valley, and that with a reason. So the main question is, if we talk about data and data ownership, the main question is, why should we be worried? And an answer you can find in the healthcare sector. So the healthcare sector shows how digital companies are currently able to penetrate central areas of governmental and political organization. According to the periodical Medicine and Health, there are already now 318,000 health apps for your mobile phone available on the market today. And the global market value of products that can privatize and digitalize healthcare by 2025 is estimated at well over $500 billion that you can make with selling health apps to people and to communes and to cities and to hospitals. But the coronavirus pandemic has shown that the privatization and the economization of services of general interest, like healthcare, that the transformation of hospitals into high-yield assets and the exploitation of nursing staff do not lead to medical progress and greater efficiency, as it was always claimed by these healthcare companies. And the countless deaths during the first virus wave of 2020 were also tragic consequences of the economization of hospitals and, as a result, a collapsing healthcare system. So, it's important to understand that the persistent claim that the provider's self-interest is also the customer's benefit was proven horribly wrong at the latest with these deaths in the first wave of corona. Many researchers and theorists of the internet have described how, based on the analysis of behavioral data, people can be manipulated and how algorithms perpetuate racial prejudice and social inequality and help spread misinformation. And for those who want to have a deeper understanding how this harvesting of data aggravates racism, I can only consult you to read the research paper Dirty Data and Bad Predictions by Rashida Richardson, who explains that in the United States, police departments continue to provide data for the development of new automated systems to help officers make police decisions. So the officers work with an algorithm that tells them where to go and where to look for criminal beings. And it is a shocking fact that these algorithms do send police officers into areas of the city with a majority of black people, because the algorithms come to the conclusion that you have a security problem there and a problem with violence there. And instead of asking yourself as a government, what could be the reason? And the answer is quite simple. They have a high rate of unemployment, and they have no access to education. So instead of saying we change the access to education and we change the system in a way that you would create more jobs, the analysis just says, okay, these are criminals and we have to send more police officers in, with a clearly racial bias, because the situation in these areas has nothing to do with the skin color of the people, but it has to do with the economic situation and the socio-economic situation. But the algorithm denies that fact and sends police officers in to secure these places. So we have to do with axiomatic decisions by algorithms that are hard to trace, because these police officers don't have to explain to us what kind of algorithm they use and what is the base of that algorithmic analysis. They just use it and sell their behavior as an unavoidable way of securing the people's interest in these areas. Another case occurred in the United Kingdom, and that is especially a really bizarre case. That was when the Ministry of Education had the grades of students corrected by an algorithm that calculated the likely final grades for the classes of 2020 based on the average final grades of previous classes. So due to the pandemic, you could not do a final test with these students. So the teacher said, okay, we look into what the students did over the last 8 months, and they said, okay, this is the final grade we can give them, and these grades were better than the grades before the pandemic. So the ministry said this can't be, because it was never that good. So let's scale it down with an algorithm, and that is, of course, a typical thing for algorithmic logics, because the algorithm was programmed in a way that it represents the future as a continuation of the past. So the algorithm can only say what is the usual behavior of these people, what is the usual grade they can get, and in response they say if people get better, then it can't be, because humans are not as good, so we correct it down. So it's interesting to understand that algorithms do not believe in people getting better, but algorithms have a stable, static idea of human beings, which is a big problem. So you can say that California, which is the current epicenter of digital Western culture, supplies us with two essentially differing narratives about human nature. Hollywood, the myth machine of the 20th century, has repeatedly told the story of people who, through enormous effort, create the unexpected, the improbable, stating that people can do things that no one thought they could. Every Hollywood movie, yeah? A little girl, timid and shy, all of a sudden she becomes the star of her school. That is the Hollywood narrative. The Silicon Valley narrative, on the other hand, and you can say the Silicon Valley is the myth machine of our time, masks itself in the cloudy rhetoric of making the world a better place, while the programmers of its algorithms seem to cultivate a rather gloomy image of humanity. They view people as potential delinquents. They want to predict and prevent them from committing transgressions or becoming weak. So in this narrative, progress can lead to little more than a sense of increased security and predictability. So this is a problem that we all have with algorithm, that they are trying to predict our behavior based on what happened before. So algorithms, you can argue, are nostalgic beings because they always look into the past to understand the present and the future. And this is, of course, the total opposite of any idea of success and any belief in bettering humankind. So we're talking here about the idea behind the algorithms of what makes a human being. An interesting phenomenon where you can just control in your own life, I don't know how many people here in the room drive a new car. New cars have cameras in the dashboard that monitor you in the interior, and they monitor your eye movements. And new cars have more cameras pointed on the driver than onto the road, which is also kind of a disturbing fact. And then an algorithm controls your behavior in the car and decides whether the driver is still capable of driving. If the car reports to its driver that it has detected fatigue and the driver continues driving and is involved in an accident, then his own car could turn against him and become a witness for the prosecution. After all, we had told the driver that he was tired. Why did he ignore to take a break in driving? In this case, too, the basic assumption is that the imperfect human being should be monitored for his or her own good, and that the machine could make decisions for him or her as far as possible and correct faulty self-perception. So it's perhaps no coincidence that the story of the server farm, which is the brain and the actual epicenter of all smart cities and all future scenarios, is a story of the state's retreat from shaping the digital future and handing over what could be the digital future to private companies. And I think, again, it's very important to understand that the car was for a long time a space that protected you from the outside. Now the car is a space in which you are monitored, and the car analyzes your behavior, and in the worst case tells persecutors that you were not able to drive and that you behaved strangely, and then you have to prove that the algorithm was wrong. In the old days, the court had to prove that you did a mistake. Now you have to prove that you did not commit a mistake. And that is, of course, a very dangerous and fundamental change in the way we deal with human self-perception and also the idea of a sovereign individual. Especially if we believe more in algorithms and we think algorithms are more objective and more capable than humans. So we looked, as the server farm is a space where this process happened, we wanted to look into the history of the server farm, starting here in 1946 with the ENIAC at the School of Electrical Engineering in Philadelphia. So that was basically the first numerical integrator and computer of the world, a monster that weighed 27 tons and contained 17,486 vacuum tubes, and it had the power of an iPhone, basically, in terms of processing data. Well, that was the beginning. And then in the post-war area, the idea of digitalization of the society was always connected to the idea of progress and of the idea of making progress accessible for everybody. So, for example, here in Germany, the planning of mainframe computers to steer the economy, to steer the country, and to accelerate progress came up after World War II, and the Deutsche Rechenzentrum, the biggest server farm in Germany, here so far opened in 1964, and you can see they took a certain pride in giving it a nice architectural shape. It was built in the middle of the city. These were the racks at the time, and this server center was also a public training center where high school graduates and students could come and learn about electronic computing and meet experts. And by 1970, well over 3,000 students had already received training in programming here. So it was a public facility to accelerate progress controlled by the state, built by the state. At the same time, in East Germany, they did similar efforts, proudly stating that East Germany is programmed rightly, a claim that may be proved wrong later. But they were still confident that with these new tools, they could basically accelerate the future. And in East Germany, also interesting to see that for this server farm, the communist regime even took down the ruins of the Garnisonschurch, a Prussian church, and replaced the Prussian church with a temple for computers. That was also kind of a statement of a public belief in the server farm. And one of the most interesting public programs where algorithms and technology should help run a country was this here. It was developed by Stafford Beer for Salvador Allende in Chile in the early 70s. It was called the CyberSyn. And CyberSyn was basically an early precursor of the idea of the internet. So Stafford Beer imagined all the decision makers of Allende's government sitting in these chairs, looking at screens and getting real-time information about the needs of the factories, coordinating the production of the factories with the so-called Cyberfolk project. And these seats are basically interesting design objects in themselves. So on the right side, you had a panel to take decisions. So your writing was decision making, while on the left hand, you would have your whiskey and your cigar. So governance at the time was imagined under alcohol and smoke. And unfortunately, it never went really fully operational because of the military putsch of Pinochet in '73. There is an interesting side plan to the CyberSyn project, which was the Cyberfolk project, which should measure the satisfaction of Chilean population and send information about the mood of the Chilean people into this room. So Stafford Beer wanted to have buttons in every household. In the morning when you would drink your coffee, you could send a message to the government how happy you are, from totally happy to devastated and super angry. 5 buttons, and that would have been processed and analyzed in the OOPS room, and then lead to new forms of policy. Stafford Beer and Allende imagined this, and they called it the algedonic meter, from the Greek algos for pain and hedone for pleasure. So it was between algos and hedone. And after the military putsch of Pinochet, Stafford Beer, the inventor of that, precursor to the internet and of that basically big server in Allende's palace, tried to sell the algodonometer to African rulers, but they had showed no interest in knowing how their people feel. So the idea was basically buried and not excavated. So you can also say that in a certain way, the blue thumb of Facebook, that is kind of an expression of support and liking something, is the last remain of that utopia that was closely connected to the idea of governance through state-controlled and state-digested data. If you look into the further history of the server farm, you can say that there is a reason. So for a long time, server farms became completely invisible, and now some server farm companies show a new interest in designing them, either as a reference to old power symbols like the World Trade Center with the 2 towers, or this is Mare Nostrum in Barcelona, quite a beautiful server in an old church. So always the server becomes almost a sacred object, kind of the holy grail of digital age in this religious setting. Or they try to embellish a server farm, like in this case here. This is the Qianhai Telecommunication Center in Shenzhen in China, where the facade is decorated with zeros and ones to depict and illustrate the idea of the digital age. So there is a tendency in aestheticizing the server farm, ending with this server farm designed by Snohera in Norway, where you would basically pay to be a member of that community with your data. So you would give away all your data, and as a reward, you would on the roof find a pool with water lilies to contemplate, and an educational garden where you can pick berries and carrots. So, and you already can say that it's a bad deal to trade all your data, give all your data away in exchange for water lilies and carrots. But of course, this is a form of like aestheticization of the server farm, which is presented to us as a friendly, almost part of our natural habitat, as if like birch trees were growing. And of course, these design proposals here make us ask some question. One is, if the greatest collective treasure of the digital society and the gold and the oil and the raw material of the 21st century is data, yeah? And if even the ability of governments and the public sector to act depends on the possession of data, yeah? Then why don't we treat certain data as common property, as a part of the public infrastructure like roads or hospitals? And shouldn't we make sure that municipal governments do not give up ownership of their own data and that the people retain the data they generate? Shouldn't we make sure that we consider ourselves not as users but as producers of data? And should we not make sure that we as a society control the relevant infrastructure, software and hardware and data centers in order to become independent on large technology corporations in the field of, let's say, artificial intelligence and machine learning and other services? So this is, I think, the central question that we have to ask ourselves is the one of technological sovereignty. Because technological sovereignty would enable us to use our data to develop new forms of a more solidary, cooperative and collective governance. It's interesting for us in Germany and in America that Spain took the lead in this counter-narrative of the digital age in 2015, when the then chief technical officer of the city of Barcelona, Francesca Bria, launched the world's largest experiment in digital democracy in Barcelona. So 400,000 citizens voted on municipal internet platforms and in subsequently convened meetings on issues such as housing policy and transport policy, and nowhere were citizens' wishes translated into policy so quickly as in Barcelona at that time, radically changing the image of the city and the image of what urban planning could be. And this experiment in Spain was made possible by the Decode project, previously launched by Bria in London, an EU-funded initiative to reclaim citizens' data sovereignty and fundamentally change our idea of state governance and city participation. So it's interesting to know that the Decode project was developed by European programmers who succeeded in developing algorithms that allow the public, us all, to decide which of the self-generated data we want to share and with whom, and which we want to keep to ourselves. And it's also interesting and telling that Bria worked with these coders in London, and they developed the algorithm that was used in Barcelona. And then Facebook saw what she was doing, and Facebook saw that it worked in Barcelona. And then they offered incredible amounts of money to these coders, and 10 of 12 just went to California, and they're now programming Facebook's new currency. So we also have to deal with that drain. And it also has a reason why these people don't stay in Europe, because we don't have a Silicon Valley here, and we don't have the facilities yet who would keep these people here in Europe. But it's interesting to look at Barcelona, because Bria was one of the first to recognize that if you don't want surveillance capitalism, you have to change the legal and the technological framework at a European level for how people's data is handled. So Bria, I quote, said, "The EU could say the data that is generated in Europe by our citizens is a public good of the European citizens, and you cannot steal that, and if you want to use some of it, you have to pay for us." And now it's the other way around. We're giving away our data for free, and then we're also paying for the services that the tech companies distill from it, so we're paying twice. Also for Barcelona, Bria designed the digital platform Decidim. And Decidim allows citizens to be involved in all phases of political decision-making. We believe, Bria says, that data should be part of the public infrastructure, like water, like roads, like the air we breathe. It belongs to the citizens. And if tools were developed that allow citizens, rather than companies acting for the benefit of their shareholders, to make policy based on their data, then the city could be reshaped not according to the interest of investors, but, and that is the promise of Decidim, to those of the entire population. And it's interesting to see that Bria got Vodafone, the city's main telecommunication service provider, who behaved, I can say it here, in the Telefónica building. So Vodafone really created some problems in Barcelona, but Bria got Vodafone to commit to not use data produced by the public for its own purpose, but to make it anonymously available on the municipal government's open data portal. And it's an interesting example because normally we would say, what can a city like Madrid or Barcelona or Berlin do against internationally operating platforms? And the answer is, of course, only city can't do much. But if Barcelona and San Francisco and New York and Amsterdam and Hamburg and Berlin cooperate and they impose the same rules of data extraction devices on international platforms like Uber or Airbnb, these companies get nervous because they can maybe lose Barcelona, they can't afford to lose Amsterdam and New York and Barcelona and Hamburg. So when we're in the situation where we say, we can't do much against these international platforms, yes, we can do that if we align on that level of what is called the Rebellious City. So that was the name dubbed for this cooperation of cities who said, we don't accept the rules that are imposed by these companies on us, we impose rules to the companies and we align as cities all over the globe. So it's a transnational platform of cities who try to fight the insertion of these platforms into the public infrastructure. But what is missing above all, however, is a place where we can all understand what the situation actually is, where we can understand that governance and the governmentability of communities and cities and countries is not longer possible without access to data. And there are dramatic examples of communities in America where the water management, the electricity management is steered by private companies because they offer the city to do it much cheaper and much more efficient than in the past. So the cities handed over power to these digital platforms and digital companies with the effect that these companies follow their own interest and they cut off areas which are economically uninteresting for them from the public grid. And we have to have a place where we understand all these phenomena, where we understand that Europe and Africa are politically and technologically squeezed today between two hegemonic blocks, which is, on the one hand, surveillance capitalism in the American model, in which tech companies are taking over the healthcare system and encroaching on security, undermining educational policy. It's also a big problem that education is shifted under the banner of digitalization of schools to private companies who run the system of education now in many countries, and other sovereign tasks of the state. And on the other hand, to this like surveillance capitalist American model, the Chinese big state with its social point system and the ultimate abolition of individual liberties. Now we see it quite clearly what happens now in China with people's data. So both Europe and Africa urgently need to free themselves from digital colonization, which is difficult when the state, the public sector, has largely abandoned the political shaping of a digital future and handed it over to private digital corporations. So, as architects and thinkers, we try to understand what the contribution of architecture could be in this process and how a new space for democracy could look in the digital age. And to find out what we could actually do about it and to basically bring it into people's minds and not to have people end on the roof of this thing collecting carrots and looking at water lilies while their data is sold and processed elsewhere. We said, let's look into the history of public buildings where new ideas of society took an architectural shape. This is Bernhard Düttmann's public library in Berlin, a small-scale library of the size of a luxurious bungalow, which allowed people to read books, to have access to education. So these people of the high-rises could just go to this thing and learn something about the world while reading books in the 50s, which was, of course, important as a part of the re-education of Nazi Germany into a more democratic society. We looked into the Fun Palace of Cedric Price, which was an experimental stage where people could try out different forms of cultural production, which then was a big hint to the later Centre Pompidou in Paris, which was a building that should popularize and make accessible education to every citizen in the country of France. And we said, so how could a building look today that is to the digital age what this was to a 20th century democracy like France, a machine that creates an effect of education. We looked into recent transformation of office buildings into facilities where all the citizens would profit from, and as you remind, server farms emit tons of energy, of heat, and we said it would be nice to have something like the SESC in Sao Paulo, a former headquarter of a furniture company that has been transformed into a social complex where people could swim on a hot day, read a book, have a not too expensive meal, etc. And we looked into the fantastic project of a town hall by Konrad Wachsmann for California City that would have a TV tower that would be connected to every household to intensify the relation of the citizen and governance. And we said, what could come out if we imagine, this is a drawing of a student, if we imagine the server farm heating a library, heating some public pools. I just go quickly through some students' projects which I quite liked. What if we would put a server farm in the middle of the city that everybody could see that this is the place where governance takes place, this is the material base, kind of the gold reserve of the digital age. What if this is a proposal by an Indian student? What if we would also show the junk that digital age produces on the facade of a server farm to remind us that the internet is not an airy, green way of doing things, but it has an ecological footprint and it should be dealt with carefully. What if also we would not always build big server farms like that? What if we would decentralize a server farm and make data available, for example here, a farmer somewhere in Africa or India, and heat with the data emissions a little greenhouse, and also use the heat of that data in that form. But mostly making it, this is an almost utopian project of a swimming server farm that would basically create all the data flux for big cities by swimming around and going on land, by a Spanish student from San Sebastian who imagined that as kind of almost the eye of God with all the information inside hoovering through time. So what if we would combine the idea of Wachsmann to combine the digital age with a facility of education and governance and the Centre Pompidou and the Fun Palace. And then the students came up as a first draft with this idea of a server farm that is also a public space, that has educational facilities, that has a huge artificial pool where everybody could swim. So it's basically the question, could we reclaim data and produce a space for democracy where we can go and understand what data is, how it functions, and what we could do if we don't leave it to private enterprises. I want to end on a quote that Francesca Bria wrote on our project on a public server farm. I quote her: "Following the democratic nature of the museum, the library, and the public square, this new institution will be an exceptional but also completely ordinary space, a true treasure trove of the digital age. It will be a place to converse and debate over a cup of coffee, but also to understand digital technology and data as something that we own in common, the true public good that can help us to tackle our big societal challenges." So I want to stop on that note, and with the idea of really bringing data as a topic into the city, but not only as an imagistic reaction to the digital age, but really to say we have to physically reclaim data as our treasure, and as a society, work with it, try out new forms of governance that will not be steered, like in the case of these cities who hand over power to digital companies, steered in the interest of the public well-being, of solidarity, and new efforts to create a communal and collective form of governance. So thank you very much, and I'm very happy to answer your questions. Thanks. I think we move, right? Yeah. To have
Yeah.
more chairs.
¿Ya se oye esto? ¿Sí?
It's okay. So it's yours.
Oh, well.
It's your turn.
Hablaré en español ya que tenemos traducción para que se...
So I'll speak in Spanish because we have a translation in order for the audience to be able to understand us. So before making a general analysis, or before asking some questions, if you have any questions, please raise your hand and ask a question. I don't know if we have mics available. Yes, we do. We expect many questions because this is a very general issue, and Niklas Maak is an author with a very complete education in philosophy, in architecture. You can feel that in the way that he writes, and he's very acute and poignant to detect contemporary issues. For example, this morning we were joking about the idea that he's a very rare profile in the world of architecture, even in the world of not only professional architecture but also architectural culture. And I said that he reminded me, Sibyl Krakauer, a very important German architect of the Weimar transition period, that was devoted his time to analyzing in a critical way the current society in a very multidisciplinary way, and writing on the newspapers. And after this long career as a writer on newspapers, writing about culture, cinema, sociology, he ended up in the United States being a professor specializing in cinema, filmmaking, and the history of filmmaking. So I wanted to mention this, and also another thing that's also very important for those of you who don't know his career. He's not well disseminated in other languages except for English, but what he has explained today comes from a book that has been published now both in German and in English, and it's the essay version, but it also includes sections which is like fiction, like a novel, because in the work of Niklas, he's got this novelistic style. I think this has to do with his very good training. But this is the other side of another work that I had just know some fragments, because Isabel has showed me some of the translation of Technophoria, which is fiction, a novel, which is about similar issues, but from a different point of view, a very different point of view. It seems that, according to Isabel, is going to become a TV series. So there's also one question there, one important question. If we take it from the Marxist point of view, between the structure and the superstructure, the invisible that supports the visible, it's also shown, expressed in this scientific way of writing in the shape of essay, a free essay, and also the crazy fiction, disruptive, funny fiction that we see in Technophoria, which is very funny and entertaining. I'd like him to tell us at some point about Technophoria, also just to open the debate before going in more specific questions.
Shall I answer to that right now? So Technophoria is a novel that has two topics, basically. One topic is a company that wants to build smart cities. And of course, smart cities sound very tempting, and everything should be better and more ecological, but it's under the premise that technology works. And we all know from our mobile phone, very often technology doesn't work. And if you scale it up, it immediately becomes a very funny and devastating experience. If you imagine all these automated cars not working well, if you imagine the connected houses that constantly control your bodies and your body's movements, then it becomes quite a bizarre thing. So it is an attempt to anticipate the world that is sold to us as a better place in its actual function or dysfunction. And the other thing is, it's a novel about robots and about the fact that when I grew up, a robot was a little tiny figure that would walk like this and then eventually fall down. So a robot was distantiated and also dysfunctional and quite sweet. And then in the last 20 years, we experienced robots coming closer and closer to us. Yeah, and we have an iWatch on our wrist, which is also a robot that controls our blood pressure. And in the morning, and I have a friend who has this iWatch, and maybe some of you have it. It would make me very nervous because in the morning, the first thing is you get an information about your sleep performance. So even sleep is commodified as a part of a performance culture. So I think it's a very unhealthy capitalist overarching regime in these objects that you put on your wrist. And they always have to perform. Even when you sleep, you're performing. And if you sleep badly, then your performance is bad and you're even more stressed out. And then you run and your mobile phone sends information about how much fat you burned to your colleague and maybe to your competitor in the office. So you're in a complete competition all the time. And I think for a novelist, this is a great setup to create absurd consequences of a society that provides us with all these so-called Internet of Things that doesn't help us, but that stresses us out, because all these things tell us you could die. That's why we measure your heart rate. You can have an accident, and then your watch calls the police. Yeah. So we're not talking about the best case scenario in the future, but always about a worst case scenario. And I think that is a form of dystopic form of seeing our lives as a constant attempt to escape death. And that is basic Silicon Valley narrative, is we have to escape death, and they help us. So they make us fear death, and then they sell us thousands of objects. And that's also something that I wanted to tackle in the novel on a literary level. What does it do to our bodies? What does it do to our perception of ourselves, of our human experience, if these robots that come closer and closer to us constantly tell us something else that we feel and say this is objectivity? And I mentioned the example with a car that tells us you are tired. I say I'm not tired, and then I decide to go on, and then the algorithm says you're totally irresponsible. In the end, this means that we have to hand over all decision making to algorithms, because we believe that they can drive better, they can make better decisions. What we saw in the tragic deaths of these people who collapsed with a Boeing, that the algorithm is totally incapable in a crisis situation to steer an airplane, so the airplanes crashed because the pilot could not intervene anymore. So this should make us skeptical. And so that's one of the aspects, that the robots come closer to us, and at some point they swallow us, they eat us up. And the smart home, the smart city, and the modern car are basically robots, and we're sitting inside the robot, and the robot is constantly digesting us, our behavior, and extracting things from us like a vampire, right? And so it's at the same time scary and comical, and that's one part of the novel. And the other part is, and that's why it's called Technophoria, it tells the story of a company that wants to realize a plan that has been existing in real life, and that was the idea to flood a large part of Egypt's desert with water from the Mediterranean Sea. And it was for a long time regarded as total madness to do this, and German engineers tried to do it in the 60s by creating a canal through the mountains from the Mediterranean Sea into the desert with 260 nuclear bombs. They wanted to explode them and make a canal within like 3 weeks. And today, of course, everybody thinks this is sheer madness, typical idea of the atomic age. And now since 10 years, there are researchers who say if we do nothing about the Sahara area, it will due to climate change, become too hot, too dry, and millions of people will have to escape. So if we do nothing about it, it's the sheer death for many people. So we should do something if we can. And so and that's also the deeper question, a philosophical question of technological endeavor. There's one group that advocates to do nothing. They'll say we have done so much harm to the planet as humans in the anthropocentric age. We should just stay away and hope that nature will regenerate. The others, and I call them the technophorians, to say we have done so much harm to the planet that we actively have to repair the planet, to flood deserts and to turn them back into savannas. Otherwise, we'll all die. And the book also tells the conflict between people who have this belief in technology and think technology should repair the earth, and others who think it's completely unpredictable and we should stay away from it. And of course, then it also tells the story of people who see it as a great occasion to make billions of money by telling the people we turn this world into a better place. And I think it's the first time that capitalist entrepreneurs can make tons of money with products and also claim that this is healthier for the people, better for the planet. And I also wanted to dissect the psychology of an entrepreneur like that, and we know it from Elon Musk, we know it from Dan Doktorov, that these people not only want to make tons of money, but they actually believe that they turn the world into a better place. And of course, the other question, just to close on that, is, and this is also crucial for the server farm thing, is that if we leave the decision what is good for the planet to private companies, they will sell us products that look as if they're good for the planet. And you could argue, and this is the case in my country, in Germany, the city of Dresden, which is a big city, cooperates with Volkswagen, the car maker, on the future of traffic in the city. And what they get is all kinds of electric cars in the future, self-driving cars that will run people through Dresden. And the axiomatic question is not raised, and that is the question, do we need a 2-ton electric vehicle that transports a maximum 4 people with a speed of 50 kilometers per hour through a city? Or is that just an invention by a car company who still wants to sell cars? And I think that is a problem if, as a government, as a society, we do not say we want to steer this as a collective. Then we hand it over to companies who sell the same product as ever, just with a green label on it. And I think that is partly true for electrical car, it's partly true for healthcare apps, etc. That if you look closely into these seemingly smart things, they're only smart for those who sell it, not smart for the planet, not smart for us. And that's basically also the topic of underlying topic of the novel. Thank you.
Wow.
Thanks.
Apetece, ¿no? Si eso tenía que ver, claro, con algo que...
This has to do with something that, well, I've read parts of this book. It says that the algorithm, as it has been used, as it creates this iteration of what exists with some slight improvements, it's micro reforming some kind. It goes in parallel with what has been called the future cancellation, like Mark Fisher, among many others, and the increase of nostalgia and so on and so forth. So, it's quite clear. I mean, the fact that one of the main problems that this book tackles, and the novel that I wish it to be published, of course, would be the delegation of future on other hands, especially imaginary people. We know that they are disappearing. I mean, we have less, and they are less sexy, so to speak, because if you delegate this capacity and this typically human capacity on someone else, even on someone that is not a human, this could be a catastrophe. It's obvious. I mean, this is a great tragedy. Totally agree.
And I basically think we are at a point where we have to understand that we always think no one can manipulate us. No one, I mean, I'm in control of my body, of my decisions. But that is only partly true because already we know that what is proposed to us on the internet and was proposed to to us by governments who trust these digital platforms is not the best solution for us, but the best solution for the platform, or for those companies who pay the most. And we know it all. If you Google your holiday destination, you don't get the best price, you get the price of the company who pays the most to Google. So you're constantly cheated on by private interest, and it's important to make this clear. And the other thing is, I think that's a spatial-temporal question of almost a philosophical dimension, is that these algorithms create kind of a future avatar of our person and try to attack us from the future by thinking, okay, we can predict his behavior, her behavior, and so we create some offer to your future ego. Yeah? And the only way to escape that is to not focus anymore on the present, but basically develop your own euphoric narrative of your future ego. And I think that is an interesting task that we also want to tackle in a public server forum. To say, it's not about just understanding how data is processed, it's also about how you could process data as an individual and as a collective, as a society, to create a future narrative that is not designed by commercial interests of those who have your data, but by yourself. So it's also an invitation to develop new methodologies of imagining your future person, your future ego. And I think that is an important thing to understand in a moment where we are not attacked in the present, but we're attacked from the future. And we're like in a science fiction movie. Right? And so they tackle a future person that we do not even know that we could become that person. And I think that is also that opens also a new perspective on how we have to investigate who we want to be and whom we could become with a new situation. No?
Okay, I could say something. ¿Qué es no quiero...
Well, I don't want to speak a lot because there were questions among the audience, but I want to highlight something that Fernando has said again. I like to encourage people to discover every dimension of Niklas' work. I don't know whether the dead Germans had sense of humor. I think that they did, more than what we think, but of course living Germans do have it. And the novel is not the only example. There are many nuances of humor in researches, but a very fine-tuned humor. I mean, something that makes us feel better when we contemplate the colder a diagnosis, so to speak. So I wish that this novel is translated, we have all discovered this novel thanks to Isabel Garcia, who was the one who discovered Technophoria at the Enya Festival last year. And the album triggered, it was like, hey, pay attention, something's happening here. Because she called people from literature, philosophy. Niklas, by the way, was studying in Paris, etc. And this is an exceptional way of work. And besides, we have a topic about how we can investigate at different levels and collaborating with different institutions from colleges, from the cultural field, and I think that that's exceptional, and we are really happy that you've been able to come along and that we are able to do more things. Regarding cinema, he was telling us that a screenwriter was calling him from California for him to change one of the Technophoria scripts that is being produced by Netflix. So it's going to be on Netflix. You have it here, and he was rewriting the script with a screenwriter from California that said, "I want more conflict." So the TV show is going to be for Netflix, and we're expecting it. And I just wanted to insist on someone, and we will open the mics. And in the server's manifesto, there's some kind of interesting tension at the end. And this is, I would say two problems. One problem is this need of rematerializing what is apparently unmaterial. To place the placeless, to look for a place to what it seems that is placeless, or as Bruno Latour would say, to make the cloud land, something like that, and to find it's like, hey, data are there, okay? So what do we do with them? And that's the rematerialization process. But the second one, that is the third part of this manifesto, is its re-socialization. And that's very tough. That's very difficult. Even if you're able to manage this the relocation and re-socialization. And the tension that we analyzed this morning was a tension between centralization and decentralization, or in other words, between civil society and state. And there are people, there are friends from different institutions. This is a very interesting issue. I mean, how we can decentralize and at the same time, how we can control this server decentralization. And I was saying that maybe at the end of the manifesto, it was like Occupy Wall Street. This would be to occupy your cyber farms. So, but it should be like a civilized occupation, not a violent one. In fact, well, the big brother is dead, as I was saying this morning. Maybe we could have invited him in order to imagine how we can occupy the server. Let's occupy the server. So let's find the server, or let's generate these new servers that would be a mix between civic center, training center. And this is the problem, I would say. The manifesto leaves this as something pending. Well, Bruno Latour used to say, it's not possible to do manifestos, but we have another one. And there's another architect that has done another one. So it seems that we can't do any more manifestos, because it seems that manifestos belong to a time of progress, of great points of view. But no, I mean, it's like manifestos are blooming. And we have another one here, and the end of this manifesto is amazing, because it invites you to think about this combination between state, civil society, municipality, relationship between the horizontality and verticality. I mean, it's exciting. And, well, Technophora should be translated, of course. And we want an immediate translation of this manifesto, too. So let's see where this manifesto takes us. But I don't want to speak any longer. I just want to say thank you to everybody that has come along. And we open the mic if there's any questions. And, of course, we want it to be really living. We want you to keep it alive. And we want to have it here in Barcelona, in Madrid, everywhere. So thanks to the embassy for these meetings, and that's almost it. Thank you very much. And I guess that there are many questions in the audience. Yeah, please go ahead.
Hay gente de muy distintos ámbitos.
There are people from different fields, people that we know, people that we don't know.
Por aquí.
Yeah, here. Yeah, they'll bring you a mic. Well, good evening. It has been a great pleasure. Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah. It has been a great pleasure. I think that every topic that you've talked about is key. But as an architect, I'm interested in this last exercise that you've done with your students, this visualizations of different possible places of this new socialization, or places for data exchange, or new data parliaments that could be like these new places. Because I don't know if you're studying or not. Maybe this is the question, because the relationship between these spaces and technologies that handle information, for example, what will happen if this technology goes quantum and increasingly smaller, like has happened with every technology that embraced data in history, what would happen? What shape these parliaments would have beyond these approaches that have a lot to do with architectures, that have more to do with archetypes of some power related to culture, Pompidou, or some of the buildings that have appeared. Maybe they would have more to do with ubiquity, with something smaller, in some kind of I mean, these places could be places for data exchange that could be more open, more fair, more balanced. So what shape would they have? Maybe I'm speaking about this, what Dilis Cofidio was thinking about in its cloud, this steam that was much more ubiquitous, that allowed us to think that these places could have much lighter shape and more comfortable, I would say, to see how we can exchange data.
Yeah, and that is a very important point, and maybe I should have talked more about the decentralized little server farm from India that is basically not bigger than one room, and that enables people on the local level to and empowers people to work in a different way, to connect their efforts to other decentralized entities. And of course, if you create that decentralized network of data entities, it's harder to control by any authoritarian state or company. So you bypass the big data nodes, and I think that is key for the future. But I think we have to think in forms of a bifurcation. We need decentralized servers that enable also local initiatives and also empower people who don't have access to a monstrously 1 kilometer long building, like they build it now in Reno, Nevada. At the same time, there is a tendency by, say, car companies to build local service for their automated cars, because it would be impossible to steal self-driving cars through a centralized server. So they need the decentralized databases, and that poses also a threat, because then you really dissimulate the knowledge and the power into entities that belong to one big company, but it's dissimulated. So I would opt for a real decentralization. And real, I mean by data that is owned by the people and then harvested decentrally. And I think that is important. But having decentralized, a network of decentralized servers, which is, I think, important and key, and we should have that and do it, also doesn't make it visible on a central level. And we still have these big tanks, these big monsters, and as long as we have them, I think it's important to occupy them almost in a literal way and say, we claim what is inside, and we want to walk on top of it, and we want to use the heat, and we want to do something with that big structure. So it's more like occupying the big ships that are there and claiming that behavioral data, and I'm not talking about data that, let's say, a big bakery needs to run the baking machines. That's not the problem, but behavioral data that is used to analyze your behavior and to manipulate your behavior and to control individuals, that should be publicly owned. And I think to create a symbol for the necessity to reclaim also the space of the data center and to allow people to walk there, because it's their data, it's our data, we produce it, so we should have a right to walk not inside, but at least close to it and see it and discuss in situ what could be produced. And I think one of the dangers of a digital society is that we say, it's all decentralized, it's all on the net, and we're only sitting there with our mobile phones, and we don't have the power of gathering anymore and to make a physical statement in the city, while the internet, as we see, is a very physical thing. No? And I think also in the last days you could clearly see that the protest of millions of people against the invasion of Russia in Ukraine had an effect on governments. I saw all these people, all these yellow and blue town halls that had an effect as a public image. And I think it would be, I had a discussion in New York when we presented the book there. It would, to my view, to be too snobby to say it's imagistic and this is 20th century together in large groups and to protest and demonstrate, because I think that would mean to give up the idea of the collective body in a city and therefore give up a large part of what we call an urban civilization, which has to do with the concentration of bodies with different agencies in a relatively closed room. And I think that the server farm in its current architectural form is blocking enormous terrains, and it's only accessible to a few security guys. And I think this is an unhealthy image of actually the distribution of power and accessibility. So the students' attempts were, I think, interesting in their acknowledging that we should have access to it physically and legally and technologically. And I think that is the idea of the server farm, which has this crust of public life and becomes part of an urban ecosystem. But I think your point is very important to say that it only works if we do not replicate the idea of one big monster and one big monster, but if we bifurcate, and yes, having one big monster that is a symbolic monster of people reclaiming what is inside, and then dispersing it into individual units that can communicate and bypass. And I think and it's even more so important what you say, because if we create this network, it's not controllable, neither by the state nor by big companies, who's exchanging what information with whom in decentralized. And there's also many computer experts say there will be at some point a personal AI that you carry with yourself in your pocket, almost like a micro server that we can communicate, and it doesn't go over a server like today. Huh? So Facebook or Google could not get a hold on our objects communicating in our pockets, and I think that is, of course, also a tendency that has to be reflected upon. Yeah. So thanks for the question. More questions? Yeah.
Right.
Well, I don't see anything.
There is one.
Yeah,
There's
there's
one.
a question.
Ahora, ¿no? Ahora, sí, sí. Vale. Pregunta.
Should I ask in Spanish and use the interpreter or not? Well, I'll ask in Spanish. Well, first of all, thanks for your presentation. It has been very interesting. This is not a question but a comment. Yes, a nuance of what you've said about algorithms and this, that they have this concept of humans, that they are very stable. They don't change, they don't learn, human beings, and we just give away our data and then machines, algorithms and robots work for us. But I would go a little bit beyond that, because I think that algorithms have an agency component. So they condition what we do. They condition our behavior. I've been reading about diary applications which are not related with traditional diaries where I would make my own notes and then I would reflect upon this. But in these apps, I have challenges and gaps that I have to fill, what I have done today. I have gone jogging, I haven't seen some friends, and even offline, these conditions what I'm going to do. So I think that algorithms produce what they predict, and they deeply change our own behavior and the way we function at individual and collective level.
I think that is a very important comment. And also I think, of course, the algorithm is programmed by people with a certain intention, and of course that intention translates into attempts to manipulate us. But I think what is also important is that we would normally, if we follow the rhetoric of emancipation and empowerment, always think if you give people a chance to learn something, to try things in a different way, they would change to the better. And that is basically the whole epicenter of pedagogy and the belief in progress. And I think there hasn't been done enough work, and of course there has been done tremendous work by Shoshana Zuboff and others who analyzed surveillance capitalism, but I think it's really interesting to look into the idea of the human nature, and that is the very basis of many algorithm programs, no? Because it also is, there is a belief, and when we look into philosophy of the past like 60 years, we find Roland Barthes, who massively criticized an idea of the human that replaces politics with nature, that things that humans are like that humans are aggressive, humans are seducible, and who doesn't look into the political basis of that state of affairs. And I think that it would be an endeavor, if we get a hold of our data, to create algorithms who are not programmed in an axiomatic way that sees the human as a manipulative, bad, and kind of gloomy being that can never change, or as this animal. And I think we have this discourse in these days on many levels, also when it comes to race and gender, and that we have a group of people who think humans will never change, humans are made like that, and we have other people who think that a lot is basically enrooted in a very violent system of exploitative capitalism, and that could be changed also with the help of digitalization, if digitalization is in the hands of politics who think more in categories of solidarity, communality, and collective efforts to create new forms of governance. So it's in the end a political question, and I think rewriting the algorithms in that way could be an enormous task for Europe to depoison us from a narrative that we imported from Silicon Valley entrepreneurship and neoliberal forms of capitalism, who see humans only as basic kind of human workforce and manipulative material for economic endeavors. So rewriting the algorithms according to another idea of human nature, or questioning human nature in the way that it has been done a million times by Foucault and Barthes, etc. But that knowledge has been almost eclipsed by these algorithms, who reintroduce the idea of the never-changing violent animal that we should steer and control and predict and prevent from the worst. And so I think the shift from worst-case scenario thinking to best-case scenario thinking is also an important endeavor in saving the idea of the algorithm and of programming from where it is now, right? So thanks for the comment.
Hola, buenas tardes. Venía, la verdad, que a la charla sin mucho conocimiento de lo que venía a escuchar y...
Good afternoon. Thanks a lot for your presentation. It's been surprising and very interesting. My question, I think that in theory, my question is, how can we see this in reality? So there are some corporations that control all this data, and they have the money. What will they have to decentralize all this data? Because thus they will lose power, they will lose money. So how can we implement this into the real world?
No, it's a very good question. Also, I'm not in fear of answering it, because I think there can be a very clear answer to that. We can only achieve that let's say in Europe, with a new form of legislation that legally stops companies of extracting your personal data and harvesting it. This is kind of a legal framework. To implement that legal framework, we have to create a technological basis for that, because all these companies said, nah, this is technically not possible, we're sorry. Yeah? You can try it, but it's not in the game. And that's why the Decode project in Spain was so important, because Francesca Bria and her coders in London, who programmed that, who coded this algorithm, could prove that it's technically possible, to prevent companies from extracting data in a Wild West manner. And I think I'm an optimist, so I believe we will look into these days between the 1980s and now as the Wild West phase of digital societies, where basically there were no state-controlled forms of steering that process. So I think we need a legislation. I think Europe is on the way of implementing that. I think in America there's a growing concern, and it's funny that controlling these huge companies was for a long time seen as a utopian leftist project without any chance to have success in a capitalist society. Now we find these critical leftist thinkers aligning with those who want to protect market economy from a quasi-socialist monopolist game where 5 companies control everything, because it is also contradicting the very idea of innovative competition, of access of smaller companies to a market. So there is a moment where Google, Facebook, Amazon, the GAFA complex collides with a very American idea of the startup, of the new idea that can make its way through it. So there is an interest in America to get rid of this monopolism, and America has a history of politically destroying companies who became too big and too monopolistic, with the destruction of train companies and other monopolists in the 1890s. And many analysts say that the rise of America in the 20th century was based on this initial gesture of destroying monopolists who have become too big. So there is an interesting political situation of a leftist critique of the regime of digital platforms and a liberal, almost libertarian criticism of it. So, and in this situation, legislation could become possible that has a huge effect on this monopolist tendencies. The other thing of how to put that into place is, of course, I think education, because the fact that so little people were caring about what's happening is, of course, a complete ignorance in technical terms. And I would include myself. It took me a long time to actually understand what's happening in a server farm, how data is processed and harvested and turned into commodities, and how also civic rights are turned into commodities, to a point that if I make money, I can afford to keep my privacy. If I'm a gig worker in the gig economy, and Vodafone offers me free calls in exchange of my data, I have no choice. I have to give them my data to make a living. So there is a moment where society bifurcates in those who can insist on their civic rights, that are rights for every citizen, and those who are very tempted to give them up, in order to get some money. And I think that legislation who clearly says this is not possible. We cannot turn civic rights into commodities, and everything that goes into that direction is illegal, would be a big step. And the next step is, of course, to create spaces, and then we're again in the realm of architecture, spaces we would all like to go and learn and understand and discuss and protest and become active members of a digital society. And I don't believe this is only possible on an iPhone with buttons I can press and say yes or no. And I think that the Decidim project in Barcelona was good because they harvested a lot of data from the citizens online, and there were algorithms who analyzed them, but then there were all these conventions in the neighborhoods for 200 people, 4,000 people, 450 people, where the state met the citizens of that area and said, let's discuss it physically in a physical space, in a little town hall, in a space, and let's try to create a new form of political decision-making here in the neighborhood. And I think that back and forth between the physical space and the virtual realm is an important thing that governments should steer and take care of. But there again, we come to urban design, and I think New York is a perfect example of how the public space was destroyed by seemingly improving it. And I myself, in the late 90s, when I was a student, early 2000s, I came to New York, and Tompkins Square was pretty wild, and there were racks of cars standing, and the kids were climbing on these racks, and some people were demonstrating, some people were partying in these public spaces, forgotten spaces. Then Doktorov came and redesigned the city, and now there is a very green-looking playground with a fence, and the kids can do 3 movements. They can do this, and they can hop, and they can be on a swing. So there are 3 movements of the body are still possible, and at 8 p.m. they close the playground, and then it's over. So, and this was sold as city improvement, but it's also a way of controlling public space. And what we have in mind when we designed the public server farm was to create a space that is open day and night. Everybody could go there, and it's totally open, undefined, and not crammed with stuff that, in the case of you want to demonstrate, blocks your movement. And we had the experience at the moment when Trump was elected, many people wanted to demonstrate against that, and they found that all the city improvement led to the fact that there is no public space that is open to accommodate 5,000 protesting people. But there were all these little fences and little benches and little charging stations and little swings that were blocking idealization of public space, that would turn it from a political space for the active citizens into a contemplative space for the idyllic city user. And I think we have to critically rethink the way we redesign the cities towards enabling us also to use it not only on a legal and technological basis, but also to participate in public city life in these public spaces. And I think that is maybe another discussion, but it has to do with the question that you raised: how can we put that into practice? So I think it is a combination of these three factors.
And what about the countryside?
Very important, and
because there's a lot of monsters there. There's a lot of monsters there. Can't you change the relation between the city and the countryside in terms of?
It's basically relating to what you said earlier on, the question of decentralization and of small scale. Because I think one of the main problems, at least in Germany, I guess it's the same maybe in Spain, is that everybody has to live in the city and prices are rocketing, while in the countryside you have all these beautiful old towns where people could imagine to live if they are not stuck there. So if they had internet and public transport that would allow you to be in Madrid on a Thursday and Friday and Saturday night, but maybe on a Monday morning be in the countryside. And the idea is that, of course, many jobs in the future could be also done from villages, whether this is a carpenter's job or an online worker's job. So I think it's not restricted to an elite of internet workers that they could afford to live in the countryside. The countryside could be redeveloped if we would bring data and infrastructure, digital infrastructure, to the countryside. So I think also the small-scale decentralized server farm could also be a motor to re-engage with country life. So I think also on that level it's very important to think about what to do with these enormous assets that the countryside offers us.
Huge project.
There is another.
This one, another.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Buenas tardes. En primer lugar.
Hello, good afternoon. First of all, I would like to say congratulations on your speech. I would have two questions, or one double-fold question, I would say. So first of all, in your opinion, who would be the ideal responsible to take care of our data so that democracy would not be attacked or could be strengthened? And a second question related to the data extraction that these companies do, especially from the US, when legislating and when having a regulation. I mean, would you want this data extraction to be banned or to foster transparency? I mean, the ads that we get from Facebook, Twitter, or other platforms are saying, well, you're receiving this piece of ad because you have said like to this page, for example. So in this sense, I would like to know the legislation of the election ad, for example, in social media.
I think that's two very important questions. I think that yes, legislation should avoid certain companies to act in a manipulative way. And the question is who controls it. And I think we saw in the case of China, but also in the case of some East European countries, if you leave it to the state to steer and prevent the internet from becoming undemocratic, that's maybe not the smart way to go, by just trusting governments. And we know it from all countries in Europe. We don't know what happens in France with the elections. We don't know it in Italy with the rise of a fascist right. So I think it's crucial to protect democracy that the citizen, the individual citizen, has access to her or his data and is in a constant exchange with governmental institutions. And in the Decode, in the Decidium project, you would basically get an SMS by the state asking you, giving you like a full disclosure, said we want to redesign the bike lanes. Can we use your movement data for that purpose in an anonymized form? And then the algorithm should make sure that you are giving your data away in anonymized form. So I think that should be designed by the state in a way that the citizen can protect itself also against the state, which I think is a crucial achievement of Western democracies. The other question is, how do we deal with the monopolism of American tech companies and American platforms? And of course we can say, over a long stretch, we can regulate them today and just not allow them to do everything they want to do. But on the long run, I think it's crucial that we develop, and I mean European countries, but not only European countries, but I think also about a data space that stretches from Norway to Southern Africa, because I think both Europe and Africa are under siege of American companies and Chinese interest and should merge together their efforts, because if we create a data space that includes Europe and Africa, we would have a critical mass of people providing data and controlling their data themselves. So it could be a good project for Europe to engage with African countries to merge efforts to create a democratic data space between these two highly problematic developments that we observe now. Because also in Africa, it's a highly extractive form of neo-colonialism happening this time on a digital level. So I think And I think awareness in countries like Kenya, where we worked when we prepared the exhibition at the Guggenheim in New York, the awareness of a young generation in countries like Kenya is much higher than here, that something is going wrong, because they are much more critical with what is happening in terms of the influx of China and of basically extractive data practices than we are here. So I think on the long run, we have to create our own digital infrastructure, including alternatives to Twitter and alternatives to Facebook, alternatives to WhatsApp. And I think it is a claim by these companies that there are no alternatives and that the people do not want to use anything else but Google and WhatsApp. I think the moment you have a viable alternative, people are willing to change and people are understanding it. And you can see it that many people move to Signal now. So there are small steps where you can see you can break the dominance of these companies by offering more attractive and better produce. But I think that has to be developed in Africa, in Europe. Also would not exclude America, because America is not one bad entity, of course, but also American critical practice is dominated by certain players from the Silicon Valley who eliminated all competitors. And I think that is also a practice that I hope American legislation will ban, that you don't produce something and you put it on the market, but you spend your investors' money for like 18 years in destroying all competitors, and then you come up being the biggest. This is the Amazon principle, yeah? You're very unproductive, you don't make money, but your investors give you all the money to destroy everybody else, and then you're the only monster in the room. And I think that is something that can be banned legally, and that would allow other companies to produce new tools and new alternatives with new data regulations. And so in the long run, we will replace Google and we will replace all these companies. So I believe also in the capacity of people to change. We will not be forever on Facebook. And when Facebook showed up, everybody thought Facebook is it and no one will ever use anything else. And now it's considered by my kids as an old people's form of communication to use Facebook. So already that is a thing which is under siege. Thanks for the question.
¿Alguna más? ¿Qué hora es?
9 o'clock.
Okay.
It's 9 o'clock. Okay, so, well, maybe just to wrap up, I was taking some notes. I think that, rethinking tomorrow, political imagination, I think. The algorithm doesn't have any imagination, and politically it's terrible. So it is, maybe we can conclude something. It's always good to draw some conclusions from these things. So, well, thank you very much, Niklas. Thank you very much for coming along, and thank you to all the attendees.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks.